Hi everyone. My name is Guy, and I'm currently a master's student at the University of Cape Town under Thomas Meyer and Giovanni Casini. So today I'm going to be talking about something that's part of my master's thesis, which is a model of defeasible reasoning for a relatively simple fragments of first-order logic. Okay, so let's get into it. Looking at the audience, I'm worried most of you know much more about this than me, but hopefully I say something interesting. Okay, so what is defeasible reasoning to begin with? A common definition is it's a process of coming to conclusions that are justified given what one knows, but which may be retracted once one learns new facts. So a very simple example of a defeasible argument is, for instance, the wall looks blue. Suppose we look at a wall and we see it's blue. We know that things that look blue usually emit blue light. And so we conclude that the wall probably emits blue light. So this is, justified given what we know, but it's certainly not a classically valid deduction because there could be sort of exceptional circumstances that render our conclusion invalid. So for instance, we might be very sleep deprived and we say are hallucinating. So there are a multitude of theoretical models of defeasible reasoning out there, and they come in lots of different flavors. There's sort of the mathematical models that I'm going to be speaking about today. There's computational models, so thinking about things like answer set programming or data log, like we saw in the previous talk. And there are kind of cognitive models that actually model how humans think, and philosophical models, etc. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, to start off with, I'll describe the KLM framework, which is a mathematical theory of defeasible reasoning for propositional knowledge bases. So kind of knowledge encoded as propositional formulas introduced by Krauss, Lemon, and Magador in the 1990s. And KLM actually stands for their names. So how does it work? Well, one takes propositional logic and you add this extra logical
Sorry. Is it normal that I am always on the first slide?
Yeah. That should not be the case, no. Oh dear. Sharing is... Bring your shared window to the front. Sorry about this. Seems to be some technical issues. Can you still only see the first slide?
Yes.
Oh dear.
Stop sharing and try again.
No, I'll try that. Stop sharing. Can you see?
That's better. We see the slide 2.
Okay, fantastic. I'm not sure what happened there. All right. Okay, back into it. Right. So as I was saying, in the KLM framework, you take propositional logic and you add this new logical connective, this funny twiddle symbol, which represents a defeasible conclusion. So this formula B twiddle F sort of intuitively stands for birds defeasibly fly. And certainly that's a reasonable statement. Most birds fly, although there's some exceptions. So kind of pre these papers by Krauss, Lemon, and Magador, defeasible reasoning was often characterized by the things it didn't have, such as monotonicity. The KLM framework rather focuses on the kinds of things we would expect a defeasible reasoning process to satisfy. So what would we expect to hold for a reasonable defeasible argument? And they give a number of examples of these things, these postulates, called the rationality postulates, and they argue that any sort of reasonable or rational defeasible reasoner would satisfy these postulates. So I won't go into them in detail, but for instance, just as an example, this top one, RW, stands for right weakening. And it says that if under the assumption that alpha is true, you're willing to defeasibly conclude beta, and you know that beta always implies gamma, well, you should also be willing to defeasibly conclude gamma as well, to make sense. And this and a number of other postulates constitute the rationality postulates. And sort of the main contribution of their paper was working out, well, how does one mathematically characterize sets of these defeasible formulas satisfying the postulates. In the same way that some first order interpretations might characterize classical reasoning, for instance. And the answer, the semantic framework that they use, is preference rankings. So you take your set of possible worlds, so possible propositional valuations, and I've got a number of them here, and you rank them by how typical you think they are. So in this preference ranking, the valuations at the top that have rank 2 are considered extremely unusual or atypical. So for instance, here we have, like in the top left world, PBF is a world in which the thing we're considering is a penguin and a bird, and it flies. And this is quite unusual. Penguins don't usually fly. On the other hand, at the bottom of this ranking, we have worlds like the bottom right world, which says that we're considering something that is a bird that isn't a penguin. So bold font means negation, and it flies. Right. So what does it mean for a defeasible formula like this one to be satisfied in a preference ranking? Well, you look at all the worlds satisfying the left-hand side of the defeasible formula, and you see, okay, is the right-hand side satisfied in all the most typical ones? So I've highlighted all the worlds satisfying B here, and indeed, in the most typical one at the bottom there, you'll see that F is true. So in this preference ranking, birds typically fly, and we can check a bunch of other examples. This preference ranking also tells us that penguins typically don't fly, and it has some kind of more unusual things as well. Like it says that things that aren't birds typically fly as well, which sounds a bit weird to us, but that's just because we have lots of background knowledge about birds and penguins and flying. Just the point I'm trying to make is different preference rankings give you, will satisfy different sets of defeasible formulas. And in fact, in a paper in 1992, Lemon and Magador proved that any set of defeasible formulas that satisfies the rationality postulates presented in the previous slide can be exactly characterized by some preference ranking. So these preference rankings really do kind of represent the rationality postulates, if you will, for propositional logic at least. So this tells you how you can characterize these postulates, but a sort of open, well, it's not open anymore, but a question that still remains is, how do you actually reason in the KLM framework? And Lemon and Magador provide quite a nice answer for this too, in the form of a well-known entailment relation called rational closure. So as a way of example, suppose we have the following knowledge base, which says that penguins are always birds, that birds usually fly, and that penguins usually don't fly. So quite common sense knowledge here. Now, we know that the rationality postulates can be characterized by preference rankings, but which of these preference rankings should we use? Well, it is the right one in a sense, because there are lots of them that model this knowledge base. For instance, the preference ranking I gave in the previous slide is an example of a model of this knowledge base. And the sort of the position that rational closure adopts is to work out what the consequences of your knowledge base are. You should assume that everything is as typical as possible up to the constraints of your knowledge base. So everything should be considered as typical as possible, so long as you aren't violating anything in your knowledge base. Here is that the preference ranking from the previous slide, which certainly satisfies our knowledge base. It satisfies every formula there, which you can check. I won't go into it now. But there's some sort of, there's some funny things in this preference ranking. Some of these valuations are much more atypical than they have any right to be. And we can push them down. So for instance, this valuation that I've highlighted in the left, the one in which we're considering a bird that is not a penguin and doesn't fly, well, we can actually make it more typical by pushing it down in the ranking, and we still have a model of our knowledge base. So we can do that, and we can do that to a few other of these worlds. We can, for instance, push this world down further as well without changing the fact that we, without violating any of these formulas in our knowledge base. And at the end of this process, we end up with a minimal model where every valuation is sort of as typical as it can be. And one can check that in this preference ranking on the right, if any of these valuations are moved lower or made more typical, then one or more of the formulas in our knowledge base will be violated. So this is truly a minimal model. And we can check what kinds of formulas hold in this minimal model. And amongst other things, we can see that it predicts that birds typically aren't penguins, which again is a reasonable statement. And as Lemon and Magor show, for any knowledge base or any given knowledge base, like the one I've provided above, there's always a unique minimal ranked interpretation that satisfies that knowledge base. So in other words, no matter what we started with, if we follow this minimization procedure, we always end up with the same ranked interpretation at the end of the day. So this minimal model, well, is the rational closure of our knowledge base. And that's, as Lemon and Magor argue, is a reasonably good notion of feasible entailment. Right. So these ideas don't really stop at propositional logic. Over the last while, they've been applied to logics that are much more expressive. And sort of a notable example of that is description logics, which we also heard a little bit about in the previous talk, which allow for not, in propositional logic, you can just express atoms and Boolean combinations of them. But in description logics, you have the more sort of expressive framework of concepts, roles, which are kind of relationships between individuals and individuals. So rather than talking about properties of one thing, you can have many things. So an example of a description logic, a defeasible description logic formula is the following. So bird on the left here is a concept, which represents all the individuals that are birds. And on the right, it's a little bit tricky to parse this if you aren't familiar with description logics, but you can just take my word for it. It says that this is a concept that represents all individuals that don't eat any birds. So this formula says birds usually don't eat other birds. Arguable whether it's true or not in reality, but there you go. And indeed, there are papers on sort of theoretical foundations for defeasible description logics in the KLM style. One example is a paper by Thomas Meyer et al. In 2019. And so they sort of do the same thing as the propositional case. They have a representation result that characterizes a number of rationality postulates for description logics in terms of preference orderings. And they provide analogs of rational closure, as well as some other feasible entailment relations for description logics as well. Right, so my initial goal in my master's thesis and in this work was to try and generalize this a little bit. So description logics can be thought of as fragments of first order logic, sort of heavily constrained ones where predicates, for instance, can only be unary or binary, quantification is restricted. And this is, of course, all deliberate. But the question we started looking at was, can we obtain a model of feasible reasoning sort of in the same style? So using preference rankings, getting representation results, etc., for a more expressive fragments of first order logic. For instance, can we do this for predicates of arbitrary arity? And can we do this for logic that has less restrictive forms of existential quantification, universal quantification? Unfortunately, we had some difficulties with the existential quantification, which I'll get into later, and ended up settling for a much more modest fragment of first order logic where we just have predicates of arbitrary arity. And I'll describe that fragment now. So we fix a function-free first order language, i.e. a set of variable symbols, a set of constant symbols, which kind of represent the individuals in our knowledge base, and a set of predicate symbols, which are the kinds of relations of various arities that hold between individuals. So here, for instance, P is a unary predicate, Q is a binary predicate, and R is a ternary predicate. Right, so we define an atom, as usual, to be an expression of the following form. So P is a predicate symbol, and T1s, Tn are all terms, i.e. either constants or variables. And a compound is a Boolean combination of atoms. Excuse the terrible pun. And a classical formula, or the valid formulas of our fragments, are universally closed compounds. So what are those? Well, I'll just give some examples. For instance, this is a valid formula in our fragment. It states that if X is a worker and X has Y as a superior, then Y is a boss. In other words, a worker superiors are all bosses. And I've sort of grayed out the universal quantifiers here because since everything's universally closed, there's actually no need to write it. So in the paper, we in fact don't write them for brevity. And another example is suppose Y and Z are X's parents, then Y is X's mother and Z is X's father. So this is another valid formula that sort of expresses a definition of, well, biological parentage at least. Right, so you can kind of think of this as a generalization of the pure data log fragment of first order logic, where we have arbitrary Boolean combinations on either side of applications, if you want. So what about defeasible formulas? So we define a defeasible formula to be an expression of the following form, where the left-hand side and the right-hand side are both these compounds, in other words, Boolean combinations of atoms. So what this is intended to mean is, much like the propositional and description logic cases, this is intended to say something along the lines of things that satisfy A typically or usually satisfy B. Or, yeah, well, as I've written there. So these defeasible formulas are intended to model conclusions that are usually valid, but which might have exceptions. So they kind of model rough generalizations that for which there may be exceptions. And some examples of that which may resonate with some of you. For instance, this defeasible formula says if Y is X's friend and Z is Y's friend, then usually Z is X's friend. In other words, friendship is usually transitive, but this isn't always the case. I mean, I'm sure we've all had the experience of a friend of a friend who we don't maybe like as much as our other friends. Or for a sort of more mundane example, if X is an eagle and Y is a bird, then usually X will eat Y. But of course, this isn't always true. There may be some exceptional birds an eagle doesn't want to eat, like say other eagles, for instance. Right, so this is our kind of language of our model. And the next thing to talk about is what does it mean for a defeasible formula to be true? So we'll start with classical semantics just to get going and then build up from there. So a ground atom, and again, this is a standard definition, it's just an atom that has no variables. So we denote the set of ground atoms by calligraphic A. For instance, this contains things like W Bob, or Bob is a worker, W stands for worker, or for instance, Tim is Bob's superior. And there are lots of other ground atoms depending on your choice of language. So we kind of go the data log routes and interpret classical formulas with Herbrand interpretations, which are by definition subsets of ground atoms. So here's an example of a Herbrand interpretation in which Bob's a worker and Tim is Bob's superior. So what does it mean for formulas to be satisfied by a Herbrand interpretation? Well, a ground atom is satisfied by the Herbrand interpretation if and only if it's contained in the interpretation. So this example Herbrand interpretation satisfies Bob as a worker, for instance, because W Bob is inside it. The Herbrand interpretation satisfies Boolean combinations of formulas according to the usual kind of classical laws of Boolean logic. And finally, Herbrand interpretations satisfy open formulas if and only if they satisfy every grounding. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'll give two examples. For instance, H satisfies Bob's a worker or Tim's a worker here because, well, one of the disjuncts is true. W Bob is inside the Herbrand interpretation. On the other hand, this Herbrand interpretation doesn't satisfy for all X, WX. In other words, everything's a worker because Tim's not a worker. W Tim is not inside the Herbrand interpretation. So, okay, quite standard stuff so far. To interpret defeasible formulas, we follow the same track as the propositional and description logic cases, and we use rankings of Herbrand interpretations. So here's a preference ranking, and you can see a number of possible Herbrand interpretations I've put in here for example. So for instance, the Herbrand interpretation in the bottom right is a world in which A is a boss and A is a worker. The one in the top left is a world where A is a worker and B is A superior, etc. And you'll see that I've bolded some of these individuals So this is kind of I guess, a difference between our semantics and the description logic or propositional cases of the KLM framework. We enrich these Herbrand interpretations by selecting a subset of constants or individuals to be considered prototypical. So in each world, you have a number of individuals, and some of them are marked as being typical. So according to this world, this is a typical sort of thing. So for instance, in this top left Herbrand interpretation, A is considered a typical individual, whereas B isn't, because A is bold. And the point of this is to allow for exceptions to the feasible rules, as we'll see in a second. So when is a defeasible formula true? Well, we say that A defeasibly entails B if and only if the most preferred typical individual satisfying A also satisfy B. So in this case, for instance, is it true that bosses are usually responsible, i.e. does BX typically imply RX? Well, we can look at all the worlds in which there's some typical individual satisfying the left-hand side, and it's these two. And in the most typical one at the bottom, indeed, A is responsible. So this preference ranking satisfies that formula. And for another example, does it satisfy if X is a worker and Y is X's superior? Is it usually the case that Y is a boss? Well, again, if we look at the minimal world and there's only one that satisfies the left-hand side, indeed, B is a boss here. So this is true too. So these enriched rankings of Herbrand interpretations have some nice properties. So for instance, they satisfy first order versions of all of the rationality postulates of the propositional KLM framework. So this is an example of kind of an analog of right weakening, which is the rule I spoke about a bit earlier, all the way, and they satisfy analogs of all of them, including rational monotonicity and all the rest. But they also satisfy some other things, which is kind of expected because there's a lot more stuff going on in first order logic. So it would be surprising if we could characterize the feasible reasoning for first order logic in terms of purely the rationality postulates. So one example of an additional postulate in the paper is, well, if you believe that A defeasibly implies B, well, you also you should also believe the rules you get from permuting the variable symbols in A or B. So in other words, these formulas are label invariant, which again is quite intuitive. And the main result of the paper is a representation result that states that a set of classical and defeasible formulas that satisfies the list of postulates, a set of classical and defeasible formulas satisfies all of these postulates, including the additional ones, if and only if there's an enriched Herbrand ranking that characterizes those formulas. So much like the propositional case, it's a sort of exact characterization of a number of postulates in terms of these rankings. So there are kind of some nice features of this approach. Well, one is the semantics is quite simple, and the representation results is a useful sort of theoretical tool. It's kind of like it's a fairly direct generalization of the KLM approach to defeasibility. And it's easy to obtain analogs of things like rational closure by adopting a minimal model semantics. You can kind of do exactly the same thing. You just minimize every interpretation you're ranking as much as possible, and you see what holds with the resulting ranking. However, there are also some hurdles that we have yet to work out. Currently, the fragment we're considering is not very expressive, and it doesn't handle existential quantifiers well, especially in conjunction with irrational closure. So we have a problem that I think is familiar to those who worked in defeasible description logics, in that it's not clear how to minimize across existential quantifiers when one wants to define a notion of rational closure. And I'm not sure how we can fix that yet. And there are some conceptual bugs too. So we talk about these prototypical constants, but what about prototypical pairs, triples, etc.? It's another thing sort of to work out maybe in future work. And finally, some of the postulates that we ended up using to characterize the semantics are not very intuitive, which, yeah, so perhaps our semantics doesn't capture defeasible reasoning as well as we would have hoped. Yeah, and that's all I have for you today.